Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. I'm Todd Landman. In the first of two special episodes to close out Series 5, we're taking time to reflect on what we've learned from the Rights Track podcast to date. Today's episode is all about advancing human rights, specifically mobilizing around them, generating robust evidence, free and hate speech, religion, the challenges posed by migration, visualizing, and last but not least, finding joy in them. Across 5 series of the Rights Track, we've spoken with a fantastic array of academics, lawyers, NGOs, lobbyists, and practitioners who've devoted their lives to the advancement of human rights in a host of different ways. From framing and mobilizing the struggle for human rights in a crowded and highly competitive space, to capturing the public imagination and intervening on the front line, our conversations have provided some thought-provoking insights into the realities of keeping human rights issues at the forefront of people's minds. Megda Abraham, head of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights team at Amnesty International, spoke to us about how the organization's work helps to uphold and advance human rights around the world. She explained how Amnesty goes about collecting data from individuals and governments to assess how well or badly countries are doing at upholding the economic, social, and cultural rights of their citizens in order to create a big picture and make a case. Describing Amnesty's Great Palm Oil Scandal report from 2016, which took a number of the world's most popular food and household companies to task over labor abuses in Indonesia, she explained that even companies and organizations with good policies in place still often need to be pressed for concrete changes to be made.
There is the broad framework and what states are required to do. There's the acknowledgement, a consensus that companies have a responsibility to respect rights. Unfortunately, even when there is good laws or when companies have policies on the books which say they're aware of issues with palm oil they're trying to address, or there's even voluntary initiatives that have been set up to say, well, the palm oil that's reaching consumers is sustainable. Well, this isn't enough. What's really needed is to move beyond this kind of broad policy formulation to really carrying out adequate due diligence to see the actual conditions on the ground. And to a large extent, what our work shows is it's very possible to do that, because if Amnesty International could do that with the resources that it has as an NGO, there's nothing stopping really large companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble from being able to check the conditions on Wilmar's plantation. So we've not just shown their problems, we've shown the roots of that problem, which is the structural factors, the issues with the way contracts are being given so that women have casual work contracts, the fact that the wage system is set up so that people end up having to bring their kids to work. And so we're saying to companies, you can fix these issues and stop the abuses. It's entirely doable and within the control of the companies. It's not a really difficult to trace supply chain. It's a very shallow supply chain. So that I think our work shows the issues as well as the solutions. And through the campaigning, we hope to fill that gap.
Collecting evidence to make a case is also at the heart of the work of Human Rights Watch, which from its base in the United States works in 90 countries around the world. Its program director, Iain Levine, talked to us about the challenges in cutting through human rights compassion fatigue. Witness statements, interviews, photography, satellite imagery, and statistics are all part of efforts to bring about change and raise awareness among policymakers and journalists for the need to act. He explained that change could be a long, hard road and not easy to demonstrate. He also explained there were particular challenges around being based in the United States.
The first question that we are often asked is, well, what are you working on the US and how are you criticizing the US before you come and criticize us here? So it's very important to be able to demonstrate that we're working on a range of issues across criminal justice, across immigration, Guantanamo Bay, the use of torture, surveillance, and a whole range of issues here in the US. Since the election of Donald Trump and a very strong anti-rights focus that he brings and much of the rhetoric he brought in the campaign, where he talked about reintroducing torture and sending more people to Guantanamo Bay and deporting more people and banning refugees and banning Muslims and so on, the emphasis on the US has intensified, and the expectations of us to scrutinize and critique and criticize the actions of the new administration have intensified. And obviously we've looked to respond when a government in any country in the world, but in this case the US, is enacting or suggesting that it wants to enact anti-rights legislation and anti-rights practice. We are obviously there to push and work on it. So we've been doing a lot of work on immigration issues, on efforts to block refugees from Muslim-majority countries, the imposition of the global gag rule, which has a huge impact on reproductive rights around the world, and much else.
Another US-based human rights organization, the Center for Justice and Accountability, was successful in bringing a civil action against former Pinochet officer Pedro Pablo Barrientos, who was accused of the torture and murder of a famous folk singer and had been living in Florida for 30 years. Dixon Osborne, its executive director, agrees that change can take time, but if you work in the area of human rights, you have to be in it for the long game.
Now, when I worked at Service Members Legal Defense Network on the effort to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I co-founded that organization right at the moment that Don't Ask, Don't Tell became law. So it really wasn't the most promising moment to lead a civil rights effort. But I had a view that, well, we could get this done in 20 years. And I think I was sort of naive in thinking that I could change national policy in 20 years' time. But in fact, we did. We did it in 17 years. And to me, that wasn't a long time frame. That in the world of human rights and civil rights, that's a pretty rapid change in attitudes and policies. Yeah, and even now, I look at our work currently on going after human rights abusers. And if you see the rise of sort of autocratic sentiment and you reflect on our U.S. government support of autocrats around the globe in ways that it should not have, and the same can be said for other nations, I think that there is a desire for every country to have the ability to prosecute the crimes within their borders. So there is still a sense of law and order that may not be cloaked in the sort of human rights clothing that we like to use, but there is some room for agreement there. So I still see paths forward, and I also take heart in the fact that law takes a long time. Litigation outlasts any individuals typically in the modern context. So we have room to continue to play a long game and advance human rights.
So does the work of NGOs like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch really make a difference? And where's the evidence to say it does or does not? This was a question I put to Professor Amanda Murdy from the University of Georgia, whose research focuses on when and how NGOs are most effective.
I've looked at these questions looking at a large number of countries, so sometimes 100 countries or more, so 1980 to the present usually, or 1990 to the present, and looking at a large number of organizations. So I've worked to try to capture what these organizations are doing and the attention these organizations are receiving. And typically I use a list of about 1,000 human rights organizations and what they are doing throughout the world. Human rights organizations can work to improve human rights conditions on the ground, but their work is not automatic. So if they have no connection to the local population, if they're just talking, if they're just shaming, as we would call it, at the international scale, a state's behavior, but they have no domestic presence, they're very unlikely to be effective. If they're actually connected, if they actually have a domestic presence, I find that's when we can see these organizations be successful. And if they can't have a domestic presence, we also find that if they're able to at least get next door or nearby the country that's repressing, and they can conceivably sneak into the country, that we also find that they're effective at changing human rights behavior on the ground, that they're actually make things better off for the local population.
And what about the rights of the very poorest people in the world? How can they be helped most effectively, and by whom? Professor Shireen Hertel from the University of Connecticut talked to us about how social and labor movements come together to prevent abuse and lobby for change.
One of the big challenges for any social movement is sustained engagement. Poor people are exceptionally busy. They have lots on their plate, not food necessarily, but lots of responsibilities and demands on their time. And so one of the things that it contributes enormously to successful social movement organization is often honestly training and support from allies of the movement. So middle class people, allies within government, international allies across borders can do a number of things to help those movements succeed. They can tell their story to funders and donors who can help support the movement's activities with very very basic things like contributions so that if folks gather for a protest march, there's food available. They can be their allies vis-a-vis the legislature and writing some of the legislation that the group might hope gets passed to protect their rights. And they can be their allies vis-a-vis the courts to take a class action kind of suit forward so that it's not just one person trying to deal with a Byzantine court system, but rather a group of people whose interests get represented in a class action suit. That's very common in parts of the world where the Constitution actually provides for economic rights, like in India. There's also a real need to manage and take stock of many petty rivalries that exist within social movements. Not all folks in social movements are saints. They're just like the rest of us. And so one of the big challenges is keeping channels of communication open and making sure that petty rivalries and grudges don't overwhelm the movement. And that is a really serious challenge. Social movements provide lots of resources and PR and attention, and sometimes people will jockey for position or power internal to those movements. And so one of the things that allies can help with is mediating conflict internal to networks. Sometimes there's a tension internal to networks as well between people who are reformist and willing to work within existing structures of power, be they a labor union or a legislature, and people who are very radical or revolutionary and just want to overturn the status quo. And so sometimes this business of negotiating is also very important as allies help the movement think through its short, medium, and longer term range goals and decide how it's going to spend its precious resources, both in terms of people, but also in terms of political capital.
We turn now to the role of academic empirical research in efforts to understand, define, and advance human rights, the ideas at the heart of our podcast. For me, its point of departure is what our next guest, the late Professor Will Moore of Arizona State University, describes as the fundamental problem of unobservability, or the hidden nature of human rights abuses. Will talk to us about the challenges surrounding counting victims of torture. He and his colleagues worked for a number of years trying to improve the methods so that these numbers would be more accurate.
The unpleasant truth is it's complicated. Under the old approach that everybody took to data sets like the political terrorist scale or the Singranelli and Richards CIRI, it's usually pronounced Siri data, was they took that and treated it as if, and there was no reason they shouldn't have, given if you go and read the materials, treated it as if it was a scale that allowed you to examine the level of violation in different places. In some very rough sense, you can do that, but the more precise you want to get about trying to do that, the more and more it falls apart. Because Amnesty International makes no bones about the fact that they are a political advocacy group. And if you talk with people at Amnesty, as we've done, about the process by which they produce allegations, they're not only trying to make sure that they report actual violations that meet a standard, an international legal standard that they feel confident about this allegation. It's the type of allegation that they would be willing to bring in a court case. It's not just something that, well, we think this might have happened, or we think this probably has happened. So that's one standard that they're trying to meet. On the other side of it, though, they have to take into consideration factors like, how will our membership respond? Will this allegation help us draw attention that is going to bring pressure against the government that is involved? So there's a political calculation that has both a mobilization component, where they think about their base and their researchers, and they need to remember, it's a volunteer organization. They need to keep people engaged. So they need to, strike a balance between crying wolf too often and not speaking truth to power. Right, so you've got to try to strike a balance between those two extremes, while also taking into consideration that Amnesty has limited resources. How often do they want to, draw attention to a problem where they know the government is not going to be responsive, when they could instead push that some of that energy and some of those person hours and advocacy effort in a direction where they think they might have more bang for their buck?
It was an honor to speak with Will shortly before his untimely death in 2017. His contribution in this area was considerable, and he is sorely missed. The Human Development Index was created to emphasize that people and their capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country, not economic growth alone. The HDI, now known as the SURF Index, can be used to question national policy choices, asking how two countries with the same level of gross national income per capita can end up with very different human development outcomes. One of the academics behind the index is Professor Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, who argues strongly that what the index shows is that a country's resources are not all that matter when it comes to measuring economic and social rights.
I think countries can move quickly over time, and I think that's what one of the messages of this analysis is, that indeed resources not an excuse for non-fulfillment of economic and social rights, because you see that the vast majority of countries are well below this maximum possible. So even given the resources that they have, it should in theory be possible to move up. Now, of course, this is like any index of this kind. It is only sort of a highly simplified picture that doesn't reflect every single constraint the country can be facing beyond a GDP per capita. You may have a problem, for example, with Ebola, epidemic, things of that kind that compromises your ability to fulfill the right to health. But this index is a sort of a beginning of a more rigorous understanding and analysis of what the challenges are and what the possibilities are. That's the way that I think this should be used. And you identify the key innovation in this, that it allows you to measure against a relative standard, which is this idea of obligation to fulfill to the maximum of available resources.
Of course, numbers and statistics play a key role in advancing and protecting human rights. But our next guest, Patrick Ball, director of the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, was able to shed more light on why and how. His work has included testifying against Slobodan Milosevic, providing evidence against Jen Rios Montt in Guatemala, and giving evidence at numerous truth commissions.
Well, we all draw conclusions about the world based on our own personal experience of the world. And so statistics, in its pursuits of figuring out what we can't see, statistics often produces counterintuitive kinds of conclusions. And I think that's where statistics is at its best, is when it's illuminating things we did not expect or that we could not see. I think that the job of statistical reasoning in general, with particular application to human rights, is to help us check our preconceptions, to think about whether or not what we see is a reasonable representation of the world, or rather if there's some other world that may be hidden from our direct perception as a result of our geographic location, our social location, our logistical capacity to go out and see things, the trust of the people who are experiencing it relative to our social position, all those sorts of things combine to shape what it is we're able to see. I think in the best case, statistics help us transcend that.
When it comes to number crunching, there are few more qualified than mathematician and statistician Sir Bernard Silverman to help us get the hard facts about human rights. Sir Bernard, former chief scientific advisor to the Home Office in the United Kingdom, produced the first scientific estimate of the number of modern slaves in the UK. I asked him about how and why statistics can help us better understand hard-to-reach populations that are most vulnerable to human rights abuses, such as trafficking and modern slavery.
There's a sense in which statistics was always about measuring things that were seen to be hard to measure. So the idea of having a census was about measuring the whole of the population, which was not actually considered to be easy. I can go back further than that. If you go back to the Doomsday Book in the 11th century, they had the idea of surveying all the economic activity of the country, and again, it was hard to reach. So the idea of trying to measure a hard-to-reach population isn't new by any means.
But it's founded on this idea that you're making inferences based on a sample of information. And, we wring our hands and we spend shed loads of textbooks and libraries full of methods for getting the least biased sample possible from which we make the strongest, most certain inferences. And even then, those inferences come with a margin of error.
Absolutely. And there are two different margins of error. So the only way you can ever do this is by constructing some kind of mathematical model to describe the data that you have actually seen. And classical sample inference is very simple. You want to know what percentage of people are going to vote Conservative in an election. You go out, you do opinion polls, and then you can extrapolate from that to the whole of the population. So if we now move back to this particular problem, it's not so simple. You can't just use classical sampling theory to say each person has an equal chance of being selected.
Yeah.
Ordinary crimes, you can go out and you can select, you can do a sample of population, you can say, were you pickpocketed last year?
Right.
And it's sufficient numbers of people pickpocketed that you'll get enough people to get an answer. Here, you can't find the victims, you can't easily ask them, you have every possible difficulty as to why the standard methodology doesn't work.
One of the most high-profile tools for counting enslaved people around the world is the Global Slavery Index, supported by Professor Kevin Bales from the University of Nottingham. But as Kevin explained, the index is used not only to tell us about the prevalence of slavery in the world, but also to name and shame some of the worst offenders.
We do put a scale in the index, and though we don't make a big deal out of it. I mean, in some ways, the journalists would all boycott us, I think, if we didn't give them a list, which they could point to and say, this country's number 1 or this country's number 168 and so forth. They make it very clear that, we'll get a lot more coverage as long as we have that list. I've been very adamant, though, in saying from the very beginning that we can't just be about making a list of the countries with the worst, and I'm using inverted commas around that, slavery and the best on slavery and so forth, because it's unfair when you're talking about a country like Mauritania, a post-colonial country, high levels of violence, serious ethnic and religious differences and so forth, extreme levels of poverty. Of course they're going to have problems, and high levels of corruption. Of course they're going to have those problems. So we've tended to use the index as a bit of a bully pulpit to not say harsh things about worst offenders, but to say harsh things about people who could do better. So certainly in the first issue of the edition of the index, it was Norway who really got it in the neck, because we said, look, you seem to have something like 400 people potentially in slavery in a country of 5 million people in Norway, where you have perfectly great law enforcement, you have good control, you have highly educated population, you have virtually no corruption. How can you even have any? Like, why aren't you slave free? And then we try to use that information to push governments, and push ideas, to help them to think through, well, why aren't we slave free? As opposed to people in Mauritania, some of whom are probably engaged in slavery, and so they have reasons why they want to continue it. But others in Mauritania would say, well, we've always had slavery, and we'd like to get rid of it, but that's a much higher hurdle to leap over than it would be for a country like Norway.
There have been few more exciting developments in tackling human rights abuses than taking the fight to end modern slavery into space. That's precisely what the Rights Lab's Professor Doreen Boyd has been doing by using satellite imagery to identify locations where modern slavery is occurring, such as around the brick kilns in South Asia. She joined us to talk about how the evidence can be used to support NGOs working on the ground to tackle modern slavery.
What we're driving towards is the fact that people who carry out slavery activity can't hide.
Right.
Okay, the evidence is there. It's on a photograph, if you like.
Yeah.
I think the key thing from an NGO point of view is that perhaps they don't know every single brick kiln in this particular example case study, and we can map the locations for them, which is the next stage in the project. What they do with that next, yes, they can go to local enforcement agencies to discuss the fact that there's a number of brick kilns in this area based on the prevalence that we know from other brick kilns, and you can infer that there may be slavery activity going on.
So really, the slavery from space needs to be combined with some ground truthing and some interventions at the local level, with a combination of law enforcement officials, government officials, local government, plus NGO activity. And of course, that will vary considerably in terms of the quality of governance within a country. So there's interaction between the sort of quality of governance, level of development, number of other features of the country, and the propensity for agencies to actually do anything about the problem, I suppose.
Absolutely. But if I can interject
Sure.
there, I think the key thing here is that it's a methodology that you can't hide from. It's a methodology that is similar or exactly the same in terms of how you conduct it right across the piece
Right.
So it's based on data that has been collected through a technological and scientific process that can't be disputed. Yeah, you can dispute perhaps the interpretation of it, but the way the imagery are served and the way it's captured, you can't dispute that. That's there. The brick kiln is there.
It is there. It doesn't move.
There's no hiding. Yeah, absolutely.
Professor Chris Farris, now at the University of Michigan, has also developed interesting new ways to look at the human rights performance of countries around the world, and he has tried to find out whether we have become better at practicing and upholding those rights over time. When I asked him back in 2015 about whether and to what extent terrible events such as the attacks in Paris and Syria influenced our perspective of human rights abuses over time, compared with what the evidence showed, he had the following to say.
These events that you just listed are tragic, and the images are salient and still in my mind, I'm sure in many others. But I do think that it's important to try to put those events into a broader context of similar happenings, similar events over time. And if you do that systematically in the way that I've tried to do with human rights, and the way Steven Pinker has done with types of violence more generally, I think you start to see that these types of events are occurring less frequently. And I think that's part of the reason why they stand out in our minds so much, because they become so infrequent that they're exceptional in the fact that they are unexpected. And there's a lot of different types of events that I think fall into this pattern. In the US, there's not just the climate change argument. There's also an argument about whether vaccinations should happen. And vaccinations, I think, have been so successful that people have forgotten the frequency with which diseases like polio and other sorts of diseases really affected the health and longevity of people before these vaccines came out. And so the relative infrequency of these events changes people's perceptions of them. And I think it's a fundamentally human thing, and that's why it's so important to try to piece all this information together in a systematic way so that we can understand how things actually have changed.
Another Rights Track guest to help us think about how people perceive human rights abuses was Professor James Ron from the University of Minnesota, whose research has looked at public attitudes towards human rights in different countries. He explained that one of the most interesting things to emerge from his research was around the assumption that both academics and NGOs make about what the public think about human rights abuse.
There is a gap between what scholars think people think, and even between what human rights activists think that people think, and what people actually think. People actually tend to think relatively positively of human rights, and a lot of the fears that we have about what the public thinks just are not borne out in our data. It may be that we're not asking the questions in the right way. It may be that our surveys are flawed, and so we're doing new rounds of surveys and trying to get at it better. But part of the story is that the human rights world has been very much immersed in a debate with other elites, scholars, politicians, political activists who are very articulate and very angry about things, religious leaders, and we, and I include myself in this, haven't spent a lot of time talking with normal people. And our data bear this out, that the rate of contact between human rights personnel and ordinary population is very, very low. The human rights community is getting a very skewed view of what ordinary people think of it. It's getting a view that is very much informed by the most articulate, the loudest, and the most vociferous debates. It's not informed by what ordinary people think about in their daily lives. And I think that's one of the things that we bring to the table is the beginning of an insight into the mass opinion of human rights. I think there's much, much more work that needs to be done. I think our work can be done better. Our work can be more precise. It can include more countries. This needs to be replicated and extended. But I think we've opened the door to a more systematic study of mass opinion and human rights.
The thorny issues of the right to free speech and the concept of hate speech have taken on new forms in a digital age. As well as creating a space for connections, communities, and unheard voices, the internet has also created spaces for fake news, trolling, and with it, a lack of transparency and accountability. Not long after the protests and violence that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, and in the context of contentious debates about upholding the right to free speech in universities, I spoke with Heidi Beirich from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which collects data on radical right-wing groups in the United States.
Hate groups are something that only the Southern Poverty Law Center produces a map and a list of. That hate group list is not related to hate crime data, which is something else that we collect. In the United States, hate crimes are defined in a similar way. In other words, did the perpetrator of the act attack someone because of who they are, meaning because they were Jewish or because they were black or because they were Muslim or whatever the case might be, right? So there's a parallel there. But hate crimes involve everything from the defacing of property to murder. And what you're looking for in these cases is, did the perpetrator have an intent related to their bias against this person or a group of people that motivated what they did? Now, the United States does a terrible job in collecting hate crimes data. That's self-admitted from the government. We report every year about 5,500, 6,000 hate crimes in the United States. That's what the FBI reports. But the Department of Justice has put out 4 studies saying that the level of hate crimes in the United States is more like 250,000 a year. So there is a massive gap on the part of the government in just identifying hate crimes that are occurring and recording them. They're literally not even a statistic. So civil rights organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League, and others try to collect information to highlight that there are hate crimes going on that never make it in the record books, and that we have a problem with racial and anti-Semitic and other forms of violence in this country that is severely undercounted and not taken seriously because we don't even have the data to show what a problem it is.
She went on to explain how important understanding the scale of hate violence in the U.S. is in order to get the authorities to take it seriously.
Whether it's people documenting genocides or other kinds of crimes of violence against communities and whatnot, if we can't document that it exists and that it's happening, there are going to be no resources put to, dealing with the problem. If the government reported every year that there were 250,000 hate crimes across the United States, that would put that particular type of violence on a level of like aggravated assault, armed robbery. And people would think, oh my God, we have a serious problem with hate violence in the U.S. We have to do something about it. Well, we do have a serious problem with hate violence in the United States, but because we don't count it, we don't do anything to counter it.
Whilst religion or religious beliefs, as Heidi explained, can sometimes be the focus of abusers' attention, we also explored the notion in our podcast that as well as the secular foundations for human rights, there are significant religious origins to them as well. Akbar Ahmed, former High Commissioner to the UK from Pakistan and Professor of Islamic Studies at American University, was keen to stress, however, that Islam is far from at odds with the notion of democracy.
Those people who judge the state of democracy in the Muslim world by the current leadership in the Muslim world will no doubt be disappointed and may no doubt come to the conclusion that Islam does not promote democracy. I would say do not judge the Muslim world today and assume that democracy is rejected or not desirable in the Muslim world. I would say step back and ask, what does Islam say about democracy? Or in the 8th century when Islam came, about an egalitarian ethos. And I would say it is very, very strong within Islam, which allows us then to build a premise that if this is the correct idea of an egalitarian society, we can then build a genuine democratic polity on that basis. So nowhere is it incompatible. For example, if you went to the Hajj in Mecca when 2 or 3 million pilgrims gather from all over the world, you'll see that there are kings and prime ministers, and you or I may be standing next to them, worshipping God there, just lost in our own spiritual thoughts and ideas. It's complete democracy. Everyone is dressed in a certain way, which strips you of your identity on earth as an important man or a very rich man or a very powerful man. When people say prayers in a mosque, again, you line up and you take the position wherever you get a slot to stand. Again, it's not based on hierarchy. It's not based on any sense of authority. So there are very strong features in Islam which promote an idea of egalitarianism.
I spoke with the Right Rev Alastair Redfern, a key figure in the Church of England's Cluer initiative, which has set up a series of networks to raise awareness about modern slavery, identify victims, and provide them with support. He agreed that although there was much to be proud of in the Church's recent efforts to tackle slavery, there was much in its past to reflect on and to come to terms with.
There's the line that says, we develop historically, we understand things differently, we know better now. This was historically contextual, and you can't, whatever your values, you don't get a value that changes the world. That's a long process. And so some people would argue St. Paul starts a thing about equal value, and it took till well before, say, in this country, before we made any structural progress, in a sense, with the legal judgments and the Acts of Parliament. So that's one way which I think helps some people. If you look carefully at Christian scripture, Jesus chooses the word doulos, which in Greek means slave, to describe himself. Paul 4 times says, I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. I'm enslaved to sin. So I think there's a very interesting thing about all of us actually get enslaved to things. You can't serve God and mammon is the great thing in a sense. But we do serve both. And I think there's quite a sophisticated but important and rich theme that's beginning to emerge about we're all subject to slavery and enslave ourselves. And there's one way of fighting that. And then there's another kind of crude, materialistic dominating of other human beings slavery, which is a totally different thing. To deal with the one that's abusive and dominating, it might help to recognise many of us are quite close to exploiting others, to being selfish, to be enslaved to ourselves, really. So I think there's quite an interesting dynamic around the word slavery in Christian scriptures that we can explore fruitfully to best equip us to understand and contribute to the fight against slavery that's unacceptable, but to recognise we're bound together in that because we're all dependent. None of us is morally superior and has the totally right answer. We're all liable to the temptation to be enslaved to some ideology.
There are few more distressing and striking events from the last decade than the images of refugees and boats flooding into Europe as the ravages of war unfolded in Syria. Coupled with the political tensions and competing discourses in the run-up to and the aftermath of the United Kingdom's vote to leave Europe in 2016, this was a highly contentious period in which migration became one of the most hotly debated and divisive topics of our time. A timely discussion with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees representative to the United Kingdom, Gonzalo Vargas provided some much-needed clarity about which countries were actually providing support to people fleeing their war-torn country.
In the past 3 or 4 years, one of the countries that has produced the largest number is Syria, which is now a conflict that has been going on for more than 5 years. Syria alone has more than 5 million refugees. But at the moment, in fact, the situation that is creating refugees at the highest speed, if you like, is actually in South Sudan. So I mentioned this also not because, particularly in the past couple of years, the world's attention seems to be on the refugees arriving in Europe, arriving either in Italy or arriving in Greece. There is a kind of a media frenzy about Europe being flooded by refugees. And I think that it's important in that debate or in that scenario to keep in mind that, almost 85% of the world's refugees, in fact, live in developing countries. They are not in Europe. They are in countries like Turkey, that is today the country that hosts the largest number of refugees, 2.99 million. They're in places like Pakistan, which hosts 1.4 million Afghans, in Lebanon, where they have 1 million Syrian refugees and where I think 25% of the population are now refugees, in places like Iran, where they have almost 1 million refugees, Uganda, another 1 million refugees. So I think it's important to remind people listening to your podcast that yes, of course, Europe has seen a significant surge of arrivals over the past couple of years, but it's important to keep that in perspective and to remind ourselves that still the large majority of refugees are choosing to stay in their regions of origin.
The rights of minority groups have been the focus of a number of Rights Track episodes. These conversations emanated from an early discussion with Professor Bill Simmons from the University of Arizona about the concept of the marginalized other.
Well, the marginalized other, there's a kind of a philosophical meaning to it based upon the philosophies of the other that dominated French thought the last 20 years or so. But more on the practical side, the marginalized other is someone who has been branded as inferior and isn't listened to in society. I use the term cauterization, which has kind of three meanings. Somebody is branded as other, as inferior, as rightless, somebody who's sealed off from rights protection. and somebody who we learn not to care so much about, so that we deaden our feelings towards that person. And you can kind of apply that typology to a lot of human rights abuses around the globe through history.
While many of us might assume that gay rights are something that are firmly enshrined in societies in the Western world, and there's increasing acceptance of LGBT people in the world, those at the forefront of the struggle for gay rights would argue otherwise. Richard Bevan, a successful businessman and former trustee of the LGBT campaign group Stonewall, spoke to me about his thought on the successes and setbacks facing the group and those people it represents.
There are many, many days where I think we've come an enormously long way. First and foremost, I guess, in changing laws, because if laws are repressive, then people will be oppressive. If laws are open and welcoming and not oppressive, then I think we live in a very different, then it leads to a very different society and culture. And I think, therefore, things like, repeal of the acts that Stonewall was set up to do, and much more recently, the gay marriage bill being passed through Parliament is just a huge step forward, not just for the gay community, but in terms of our human rights overall. So there are legislative parts that I am very pleased to have seen and seen it happen in my lifetime. I think then there's a general sense of things like pride, and not just London Pride, the prides that now exist all around the UK, a celebration of diversity and inclusion that happens to be led mainly by the LGBT movement. But I think when you see it and you see Black Pride and things like that, it is about, for me, inclusivity. So there's lots of me thinking we've come a long way. And then there are times when I think, gosh, I wonder how much the progression we've made has been partly buried. Homophobic feelings, for example, or racist feelings are just buried because people don't think it's okay to say bad things. And then you have what we've just seen around Brexit and Trump's campaign and things like that, where you start to see what I think has been buried come to the surface, and people think it's okay to be racist because if the now becoming leader of the main powerhouse of the Western world, it's okay to be racist. Well, it's okay for me to be racist. And we saw lots of appalling racism in the Brexit campaign, and what we also saw was a significant rise in homophobic hate crime immediately after Brexit, and that's continuing. So good progress, and really, really pleasing and exciting progress for acceptance without exception, but it is still there, and I still think we have a long way to go.
President Trump's inauguration in 2017 prompted concerns among many groups about minority rights, not least of whom women. A series of marches to coincide with International Women's Day that year saw thousands of women across America protest against his presidency and raise their concerns about the implications of it for women's rights. This was the topic of conversation for my Rights Track discussion with sociologist and feminist Monica Casper, formerly of the University of Arizona and now Dean of the College of Arts and Letters at San Diego State University.
We have had presidents before who have been sexist. This is no surprise to anybody. But to have somebody like Donald Trump, who so embodies a kind of white nationalist misogyny that is going to challenge women's lives on so many fronts, it just feels horrible. And I think that this is what we're seeing in terms of this response on Facebook and the marches, and a chance to go and have a show of strength in a long line of marches that go past, centuries, to show a kind of civil discontent with what's happening. And it is also about our right to free speech and our right to assemble. I mean, these are all constitutionally guaranteed rights. And this is also a presidency that wants to threaten many aspects of the Constitution. So I think it's multi-layered, but not just a celebration, right? I mean, it's a moment to stand up and say, hey, Trump, we're here and we're watching. I do think it's a good thing. And, there are some folks who argue that marching is silly, that it's not going to lead to anything. But I do think a show of strength, a visible show of strength internationally, is important. It's a message to the Trump administration. It's also a message to all of the Republicans who initially were hesitant about Trump and who now are lining up behind him, sort of in lockstep. I think they need to know that we're watching and that there are many, many things that we can't allow.
The rights of minority ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities around the world is the focus of the work of Minority Rights Group based in London. Its Deputy Director, Clare Thomas, talked to us about the challenges of identifying the route to success and what that looks like.
We struggled with a very linear model of seeking change, whereby you start from A and you end up at B, and you pretty much know what route you're going to go from A to B. We've kind of done that on a few occasions, and we've found that we've ended up in C, or we thought we were in A, but in fact we weren't, because something happened in terms of a negative context shift. So we either frame a result or an indicator which is very broad, so we can capture a lot of change under it, or we have a much more holistic way of looking at change that is much more around scanning what's happening in the environment and seeing if we can track anything back to anything we've done. And there are major challenges in this area, as I suspect you know.
Discussions around increases in hate crime against refugees and other minorities, especially in the United States, have led me to ask myself and pose the question to human rights colleagues as to whether America needs its own Truth Commission, and whether this might provide Americans with the opportunity to pause for thought about some of the underlying problems facing American society today. I invited Dr. Karen Salt, now at the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, and Dr. Christopher Phelps from the University of Nottingham to discuss this with me.
Yes, I think it's interesting, this moment. What you've been working on quite specifically, and I think what you've been struggling with, is trying to figure out what sort of discourse needs to happen in public. What are the ways that people need to sort of work through and think about various different ideas and various different problems. In some ways, we're talking about these hauntings of the past that sort of pervade the present, not only within sort of infrastructures and institutions, but the kind of day-to-day stuff. I mean, here in the UK, for example, we know that there were huge spikes after the EU referendum, for example, in incidences of race-based hate crimes, to the point where there is now actually going to be massive investigation into this. But there was a lot of actual, just fairly simple things of people walking down the street and people yelling at people on tubes and on buses, and a type of behavior that we also see online in terms of just vitriolic kind of language. So there's almost a question of, yes, let's have a commission, but it's also how do we reshape the way we talk to each other about this set of issues and problematics.
You had several centuries of slavery, followed by a full century of Jim Crow racial segregation, and then there's the difficulty, which Karen's comments are getting at, of trying to make heads or tails of precisely where we now stand. On the one hand, the country has come far enough to elect a black president, and in its civil rights laws is light years ahead of where it was, say, in 1950. But on the other hand, there's deep-seated structural inequality, and there is flourishing in this very year of kind of flagrant racism in political discourse of the kind that we thought we were beyond to some extent. If we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission now, my sense is it might perform a really useful role in terms of information gathering, because one problem in the United States is there's no kind of national databases. It took the Guardian newspaper to chart exactly how many African-American victims of police violence there were in the course of a year, and they had to put immense investigative resources and have reporters devoted full time to it. And how paradoxical that it's a British newspaper deciding to make that a news priority rather than the federal government having any kind of accessible records on this. And that's not accidental, because there's the National Rifle Association. It doesn't want any research on gun violence, period, whether it's by police or by citizens, and they block it politically. So where I'm going with this is that I can see it playing a useful information gathering role and discursive role in people learning how to discuss these things maybe in a more constructive way. But I worry that perhaps the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa happened because there was a revolution and because white South Africans had to come clean and be a bit honest about the nature of their history. And I wonder if the dynamics are the same in American society right now, or if we don't have such a powerful right that it would kind of obstruct the usefulness of it ultimately and undermine it and sabotage it in ways that would actually possibly be disastrous for its intention.
We heard earlier how Professor Doreen Boyd and colleagues at the University of Nottingham are rooting out slavery from space. And a number of other rights track conversations have been about how we can picture, capture, and visualize human rights, and how that helps us advance them using both traditional and new methods. My conversation with award-winning photographer and environmental rights campaigner Garth Lenz was particularly enlightening. Garth has used his high-definition and large-scale photographs to draw global attention to the environmental degradation resulting from oil exploration in the Canadian tar sands region.
You know, the power of the still image in particular can really change the way people think about these issues. And, you know, I always mention this ad I saw a number of years ago, I think on the back of National Geographic or something, where there were 4 yellow sort of empty frames. Under each of them, it had a brief sentence describing the image that might be in that yellow frame. And these were images that, you know, pretty much any of us could call to mind. You know, a young girl runs down a roadway. A soul man, you know, holds up a line of tanks. These images have become to symbolize these subjects, injustices, war, and been huge motivators, I think, for the public to demand the kind of change that we all want to see. So I think photography, especially here where I am based in Canada, although I travel widely, the industrial sacrifice zones are so vast and so visceral and so visual that photography seems just such an effective way to communicate that to a broad audience.
For Garth and many others, pictures really do speak 1,000 words when it comes to advocating for human rights. Visualizing data in a way that's meaningful and useful for different audiences is something that human rights researcher and lawyer Professor Meg Satterthwaite from New York University has given a great deal of thought to. I spoke with her about working across academia and practice, what the challenges are around evidencing impact, and the role of data visualization in communicating findings effectively.
One thing we've learned very strongly, both from practice and also from research, is that different audiences have different preferences or maybe are open to different styles of communication. So an audience that sees itself as a very savvy one, maybe a policymaker, someone who's in a decision-making position, will often want to see, for example, a table of data. They'll want to look behind the numbers. They'll want to actually be able to see what your methods are, look at in fine granularity what different data might be. Whereas a more popular audience might like to see something that simplifies the data a little bit more, perhaps a graph or some other form of visualization. And then, of course, a grassroots or maybe a less sophisticated, I don't want to use that term, but maybe less Western educated, not used to looking at numbers a lot audience might need something that's oral, a community meeting to explain the data so that it makes sense. So all of those things are potentially useful, just depending on what the context is and what your advocacy target is. We did look into some of the kind of best practices in terms of clarity and comprehensibility and understanding. And I do think that the more complicated forms are better left to a very savvy user. And so if you're a human rights advocate and you're preparing a report for a general audience, you're probably not going to want to use something that has a really large amount of data in it in terms of the number of variables you're demonstrating or the types of relationship you're explaining or the explanatory variables that you're using. You're going to want to probably have a series of visualizations that might pick up 1 or 2 relationships in each one.
These early episodes of the Rights Track have shown us that at the heart of advancing human rights is an evidence inference methodological core, where significant questions of human rights is subject to rigorous research methods, informed by well-developed theories, and supported by the analysis of qualitative and quantitative data. These episodes have demonstrated the unstinting commitment of scholars and practitioners to the advancement of human rights, work that is often carried out under difficult and challenging circumstances. We have also learned that the advancement of human rights is a long-term struggle, the fruits of which are often born many years after a human rights issue is first identified. I'd like to close this episode on a note of optimism, which characterized my discussion with Professor Bill Simmons from the University of Arizona, who's been researching the joyfulness of human rights, something we might not instinctively associate with the topic, but which Bill explained is essential to a better understanding of where the world is with human rights.
We talk about Rwanda in April 1994 as the start of that genocide. We almost never talk about April 1994 being when South Africa voted for the first time after apartheid, right? And the just incredible joy, that inconceivable joy of standing in line, people being able to vote for the first time. And I thought maybe we're only telling half the story. I think human rights is also about victory. It's also about recovery. It's also about happiness. And we see it in the social movement literature. We talk about successes and we talk about happiness and happy crowds, things like that. But we don't talk about it in some other contexts, and I think we should, and I think we're doing a disservice to our students and also a disservice to the human rights experience if we don't bring in the joy as well.
Thanks to Bill Simmons and all the guests who have appeared on the Rights Track since we launched the podcast in 2015. It has been and continues to be a very important part of my work in trying to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today.